Hi and welcome to another episode of PDA Dad UK. In this episode we're going to be looking at pathological demand avoidance and also oppositional defiant disorder. Two conditions that are very often confused, and we're going to look at the differences so that there's a clear understanding of exactly what the two are and what the differences are. So as I say, welcome back to PDA Dad. We've had a week off, half term, but we're back and going, and we won't have this issue this summer. I'm getting a man cave built and I'll be able to have a studio in there and I'll be able to do this regularly without having to worry about kids walking in and interrupting and stuff like that. So as I say, we're going to be looking at PDA and ODD, so pathological demand avoidance and oppositional defiant disorder. They're two very similar conditions. However, they are different. And in fact, when my daughter was in the process of early diagnosis, something that we were alerted to first was actually oppositional defiant disorder, ODD. And we then discovered PDA and were told, actually, it's PDA that your daughter has. But we're going to look at the difference between the two and the similarities and explain how they work. So, we've already looked in previous episodes at what pathological demand avoidance is. If you have a look in the link in the description, you can go and look at that. However, there is an error in that video. And in that video, I explained that PDA was what ODD is called now, and that is actually incorrect information. I'm going to be redoing that video in the near future to explain in more detail. But yes, I was under the impression and told at the time that basically PDA was a new phrasing for ODD. That is not correct, and it's something I need to address by redoing that. They are actually very, very similar. A lot of the traits for oppositional defiant disorder are very similar to what you would find in pathological demand avoidance, but there are some subtle differences, and it is a very different condition when you actually get into the details. So, oppositional defiant disorder. Now, there's always going to be an element of this in any child. All children are going to be defiant and oppositional at some point. They learn their boundaries and they learn where to push the boundaries and where to restrict them, and they learn to have their own voice and their own say. These are perfectly natural, everyday things that go on with kids. However, when you look at oppositional defiant disorder, it's a stronger and more persistent way of dealing with this, and it actually becomes something that is more persistent and constant, and is obviously therefore an issue. So for my son, he's at that age now, he's about to turn 6, and he is learning that defiance, and he's coming out with it every now and again. You're like, no, I'm not doing that. Well, yes, you are. And, we get it, you clean up your toys. You've been playing with them all morning. It's time to clear them away. No, I don't want to. Well, you're going to have to. And he's learning to sort of test the boundaries and know where he sits within that. With oppositional defiant disorder, it pushes beyond that and it becomes an outright refusal. And this is where PDA and ODD are very, very similar. So what are some signs and traits of oppositional defiant disorder? First of all, is an irritable and angry mood. Now, again, this is something that I see with my daughter with PDA. However, there are subtle differences when it comes into the more detailed side of things. But what does happen with oppositional defiant disorder is a constant anger, often very sudden anger, and an irritability. So there'll often be that sort of trudging around and feeling very irritable. And you can see that in the day-to-day. So this obviously crosses over into how they deal with other people. And so they can be very annoyed with others and very irritable with others and very focused on others' annoyances and play on that very strongly. And this, of course, carries over to often being angry and resentful. And so that resentful side of things is often really, really present. So if they are forced to do something, there's often a real huff and a puff and a real resentment that accompanies it. There's a real unhappiness that they're doing this, and a real, as I say, resentful, really bitter attitude that accompanies it. So this leads over into being argumentative, and they'll often argue very strongly with adults and authority figures because they're the people who are basically placing the demands upon them that they are defying. Another interesting one is that they'll often specifically look to annoy and target people for creating a response. That's part of that oppositional defiant disorder, and it's pushing the buttons to get that reaction. And that will lead to basically blaming other people for the issues that they've got. So if something has happened, they've prodded and they've pushed and they've targeted somebody and it gets to a certain level, they get a reaction, they then blame the other person for that reaction. They don't focus it back on themselves, and either they don't see or they don't want to see or refuse to acknowledge their role in what's occurred. So that leads on to being, can be kind of spiteful and vindictive. Now, these are things that appear to be that way. And I get worried about the phrasing that's often used with these things. It's not something they're doing out of a spiteful or vindictive nature. It's something to do with the condition, something to do with the disorder itself that causes this. And that's really important to note. And it's so easy to just see kids as being, brats or poorly behaved. So many times there's more going on, and we know this through masking, which we've looked at before. We know this through PDA, which is, the inability to acknowledge the demands and move on from them. So, these things are there because there's something going on inside and there's more to it. So it's so easy to just be upset and just label a kid as naughty. That's not the case with these kids. Oppositional defiant disorder is something, along with PDA, that's inside and innate, and it's not something they can necessarily control in the same way that a neurotypical person like myself would be able to do. Now, oppositional defiant disorder can vary in its severity. You can have mild, moderate, or severe ODD. So for a mild version, it may be that only certain settings promote the behaviours. It might be that at school they behave like this, but they're not behaving at home like that at home. Or it could be reversed, but it's one setting that's creating the oppositional defiant side of things. So that's really important to note. If for a mild person, most situations they can be very, very content and get on with life as normal, but it can be one particular setting that really does trigger it. Moderate is where it's more than one setting, but not too many. So one or two, maybe three settings where there's different things that are triggering these behaviours and these responses to the situation they find themselves in. And severe is when basically three or more settings where they're being triggered. That's where it's considered severe oppositional defiant disorder. So as I say, there's a difference between oppositional defiant disorder and pathological demand avoidance. They are two different conditions, and the primary one is that ODD is not part of the autism spectrum. So it's not considered a related condition to autism. PDA, on the other hand, is very much linked with autism. It is part of the autism spectrum. Now, there are some movements in the US trying to have PDA seen differently and that it's a separate thing. I'm somewhere in between. I think that PDA is definitely related to autism. I have yet to know somebody who has pathological demand avoidance who isn't already autistic or doesn't have autistic traits in one way or another. With oppositional defiant disorder, it's not related to autism. A person can have ODD without being autistic themselves first. And that can come back to the sort of the root causes for ODD. Now, they're not well established or known, but there are certain causes that are there, and we're going to discuss those in a little bit. So if you really want to get down to the sort of brass tacks of the difference between oppositional defiant disorder and pathological demand avoidance, it comes down to how you deal with it and how they respond to the dealing with it. With oppositional defiant disorder, strong boundaries are essential. And I would argue that they're the same with pathological demand avoidance. You have to have really strict boundaries in place that you know not to cross. However, with oppositional defiant disorder, having those limits is really important, and then they can't be flexible in the same way they are with PDA. So with PDA, and this is the real difference, and I think this is where I really picked up the difference between my daughter being potentially oppositional defiant disorder or pathological demand avoidant. And the difference was when I have really strong boundaries in place, and I do have strong boundaries in place for my daughter because we have to for safety reasons. But with those boundaries, they make things worse for my daughter. So if there's a demand placed, and it doesn't have to be just a request, it's something that she knows she has to do. So we see this with school in particular in the mornings when she has to get to school, she knows she has to go to the toilet before she goes. It's part of her routine and something she knows she has to do, but it creates overwhelming amounts of anxiety within her, and that really reflects. She often has mini meltdowns or occasionally a full-blown meltdown, just about the fact that she knows she's got to go to the loo and she's got to be out by the time the taxi comes. And it creates a list of demands that just creates so much anxiety. With oppositional defiant disorder, it's just an outright refusal to do it, and an attitude that comes along with it. So it's reflected in that resentment that we talked about, and the way it's done and the way that it is responded to. And it's being told to do something and then resisting that, defying what that is, being oppositional rather than it being a demand that's created the anxiety. It's the control aspect. Again, they're so closely related in so many ways. Control aspect's a huge part of pathological demand avoidance, but with ODD it is very much that needing to be in control of their situation, but it's to do with this inability to comply and that need to be defiant. So what causes oppositional defiant disorder? As I say, there's no real established cause. So there are theories and there are likely triggers, and they can be a combination of things as well. So the first and probably primary one is a detachment in parenting. Now that's not blaming any parents who have kids who have ODD, and it can be triggered by many things. So it could be hospitalizations or any number of things that have led to a detachment in the parenting, and so that can lead to oppositional defiant disorder. And I think that's the key. Oppositional defiant disorder is something that is a behavioral condition. Pathological demand avoidance is an innate part of the brain function. It's part of the autism spectrum because that is just the way the brain functions. ODD is not like that. ODD is actually a separate thing because it can be triggered by things like parenting styles or an attachment or an issue with the relationship between the ODD person and the parent, and that detachment can create these issues. And you often see kids who do come from challenging backgrounds who display ODD tendencies. So, as I say, that detachment can be caused by so many things, and it could be mental health within the family, and that's something that is often relayed. Sort of basically the mental health can create that detachment because there may be periods of depression or struggle, and it just creates that barrier, and that's what needs to be overcome if you're looking to treat oppositional defiant disorder. Very often kids who are in an abused or neglectful situation will display ODD, and you can see that just in general life. So many kids who are from challenging backgrounds, who've suffered abuse or have been in homes where there is abuse or neglect, that obviously triggers that massive separation anxiety between parent and child and leads to the oppositional defiant behaviours. And so often those are related to socio and economic factors within the home. So, it just seems to be a thing that a lot of those challenging home environments come from a lower socio-economic environment, and that's not labeling that at all. And I know so many people who have low income, we're not a high income family ourselves, but we don't deal with ODD. That is not necessarily a trigger for it. And there are many people who have kids who might be displaying ODD who are in, higher socioeconomic backgrounds as well. It all seems to really just come back down to the parental relationship, and there's so many things that can trigger difficulties there. It's often linked to other mental health issues. So ODD can come with other forms of mental health issues. So things like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, depression in itself, just a clinical depression, that kind of thing. And they can often lead to these sort of disorders. And you see that come out with kids who are going through a depression or something in that sort of realm. The defiant disorder comes in, and you can see a refusal to do things and just to comply or be part of things. That opposition and defiance is often indicating something deeper going on. It can also be triggered by genetics. So in the same way that PDA is an autism spectrum condition and that's related to genetics, it comes down to the genetics that go behind it. And ODD can be the same way. So it can be something that is passed on from generation to generation. And finally, friendship groups. Now, these have a big impact. And you see it quite often. Kids in really positive homes can suddenly start displaying these behaviours, and it's simply because they've fallen in with a crowd or a group of friends who are prompting this, and it triggers something. And it can be an insecurity within that friendship group. It could be being encouraged to behave a certain way, and the detachment takes place. It creates, again, you know, I think I probably went through this myself as a kid. I went through a very rebellious stage when I was in my teens, and I would say I was very much displaying oppositional defiant tendencies, especially when it came to my stepmother. And obviously that's a really good example. Between me and my stepmother, there was a very fractured relationship. My dad was away a lot at the time with work, not his fault. He had to go overseas a lot with his job. I was left alone with my stepmother, and we had a very fractured and damaged relationship. And that led to me displaying a lot of very oppositional and a lot of very defiant tendencies. I got into trouble. I got done for shoplifting a couple of times, and my anger was just bubbling. And in fact, my anger was something I had to deal with when I was I moved out of home at the age of 18, very early on. And I realised I had this anger in me, and actually it was playing guitar that really helped me to express it and resolve it. But I had to deal with that anger that was in me and resolve it. And that came to having to go through a lot of things with forgiveness and understanding that I've just got to let some things go. Whether that was justified or not, I needed to let it go and let it lift off my shoulders. And once I was in that situation, I found things that the anger really did drop away. And that defiant, and I actually became I wanted to repair the fracture that was there, and it was never able to be done. But it's something that I wanted to do, and I did try to get done. Sadly, too late now. She's no longer in the picture, but it's just one of those things that I have to accept. I need to forgive, move on. She's never going to know that, but it's there. So treatments for ODD, and again, this is where the really big difference between ODD and PDA come in. PDA isn't something that you can cure. Autism isn't a curable thing, and it doesn't need to be cured. With autism, you need to adapt yourself. So, and this is really important. I have to adapt to my daughter's condition, and I have to accept it and work with it. With ODD, it's something that you can actually treat, and it's actually something that it's more of a psychological condition than it is a behavioural condition, if that makes sense. So early intervention is essential with ODD. The sooner that you can start dealing with the behaviours and dealing with the traits that accompany ODD, you are in a much better position to move forward. The sooner it's dealt with, the sooner it's able to be, and it becomes less established and part of who the person is. It's something that can be moulded and changed as time goes on. So early intervention is essential. Second is the home environment. If there are fractured relationships between the child and the parent, they need to be addressed. Now, as I say, I'm not saying that every kid has a broken or damaged home that is in the situation where they have oppositional defiant disorder showing, but it's something that really does, you can just see it so much between the parental relationship with the child. So that needs to be addressed. And if that's the home environment, if there's, and there are situations where there are abuse and things like that taking place, neglect, that kind of stuff, that needs to be addressed. Very often with ODD, social services will be involved. And it's one of the first things they'll look at is the home environment and also the school environment to see if there's any triggers taking place there. As far as medications go, it's not really something that's medicated. There are some crossovers with ADHD, and we've looked at ADHD in a previous episode. The link will be in the description. But so that there is some crossover, and some ADHD medications can help with ODD. And I think, again, ODD and ADHD are often things that kind of cross over with each other in quite a strong way. There's almost like a 3 circles Venn diagram that, there's this little bit in the middle that they all sort of cross over and join and meet. So for treatment, now I said it's very important earlier to have very strong boundaries in place, and that is. However, the best way to deal with oppositional defiant disorder is actually with a positive. So rather than punishing And I mean, this is so similar to PDA in so many ways. Rather than punishing negative or challenging behaviors, it's rewarding and acknowledging the positive behaviors that come in. It's a much better way to deal with so many different facets of life. So as I say, this comes into play with my daughter. We do attempt to really reward positive behaviors. If we've seen something that's being done well, we praise it straight away. And we link very quickly between the positive event and the reward, so that it's understood. If there's a treat being given because of positive behavior, we make it very quickly between the behavior and the reward, so that the connection's made immediately. If you leave too long between it, the link is, it's like a piece of cheese being stretched, if you like. At some point it's going to break, and it's going to get thinner and thinner until it breaks. The closer it is before you start pulling the cheese apart, the thicker and the more obvious that connection is. Consistency is essential. And, this is again very much with PDA, having those boundaries in place and showing it consistently. If you have flexibility, and this is something that can happen between parents very often, it's something we had to deal with in my wife and I's relationship, because we were very early on very different in our patterns and approach. And there was I've always been not overly strict, but I've had firm boundaries in place, and my wife wasn't so much like that. And we've had to come to a point where we've met in the middle, so that there is a consistency between our parenting styles to ensure that the same message is getting through. And it's something you hear through any parenting course you do, any form of work you do when you're learning to parent. That consistency between parents and that approach is so important. For my daughter, with the PDA side of things, we involve the school with that. We're very, very communicative with my daughter's school, and they're very communicative with us. We talk a lot, because we found that if we have that established, strong relationship in place between us and the school, we do the same things the same way. There's no difference between what's allowed and what's not allowed at school, and what's allowed and what's not allowed at home, or very little difference. Obviously, there's going to be variations on things because they are different environments. But for the main part, the things that are wrong at school are wrong at home. And that's very, very clearly established. The things that are right at school are the things that are usually right at home as well. And so we can play that between each other. We also communicate, so we know, she knows she can't manipulate school now to be concerned about home life, because we talk so often, we talk so freely between the school and myself, that we know when, they know what's gone on at home. They know when we've had a challenging weekend or a morning with my daughter. I message the school, they know. And if she goes in saying anything, it's like, this happened, didn't it? And she's like, oh, yeah, that's right, you guys know. That relationship and that communication is essential. And it's the same with the marriage relationship or the partner relationship, or even if you're, in a separate homes where, the dad or the mum lives elsewhere from the kids, and there's visitation and stuff like that. The importance for both parties that communication and that consistency in parenting is essential. Something we've often discussed in this channel, and we've discussed it in previous episodes, such as the dealing with challenging behaviours and meltdowns and stuff like that, is tone of voice. It's something I've acknowledged I struggle with, because when things get to a certain point, you have to, if someone's about to get hurt, you go, whoa, stop, you've got to run in and stop it, and you've got to react in a certain way. I struggle with this greatly. It's like stop, and then you get to a point where you stop. Keeping that calmness and that evenness in your tone is really important. Our kids respond to our own behaviours, and if they're seeing us reacting a certain way, or acting in a certain way, or being angry or not angry or whatever, they're gonna play into that. So I see this with my daughter. If I get angry quickly, or if someone else gets angry with her quickly, she escalates really quickly. It really ramps up so fast. Another thing that experts recommend is having a weekly household chore, something that is the responsibility of the person to go and do, and to make sure they have that done every week. Positive reinforcement in place, so that when it's done, there's reward, there is praise. And I think the key for anything like this, perseverance, is essential. You have to be able to stick with it. It's not going to change overnight. It's not going to change in a week or a month, maybe not even for years. It can take a long time to work through the background issues that are creating this, and that's really what has to be dealt with. However, patience and perseverance It is essential, and it will, you will get there in the end. And that's the important message to take with it. So that's the real key difference. Basically, oppositional defiant disorder is exactly what it says in the box, as is pathological demand avoidance. Oppositional defiant disorder is something where it is an oppositional thing and it's defiance of an authority figure or an authority setting. For pathological demand avoidance, it is actually the demand itself, and it's not restricted to commands or instructions given by a parent. It can be anything. It can be knowing that you need to have your meal at a certain time, and that creates an anxiety in itself. We spoke to Laura McConnell in a previous episode, who is an adult PDA, and she explained that she struggles with the shops. She has 3 supermarkets within a 5-minute distance of where she lives, but she still gets home delivery because the demand of having to go out, get to the shops and do the shopping and get home is just too much. In somebody else's hands, where it's delivered to the house and it just then needs to be unpacked, alleviates that demand. It's the demand that is the cause of the anxiety, and the anxiety that is the cause of the pathological demand avoidant traits and behaviours. With oppositional defiant disorder, it's usually due to a fractured relationship, and it's due to an environmental issue, and it's something that can be dealt with and overcome and reformed over time. So that's basically what I wanted to say. It's a really important issue, and it's something, as I say, ODD and PDA are so often misdiagnosed with each other, one in place of the other, but they're also so similar in so many ways. And a lot of the tactics that you use to deal with them are very similar. That consistency and the strong boundaries are so important there. Needing to reward the positives and not punish the negatives. They're also important. There's so many similarities. It really comes down to is it a demand that's causing the issue and then triggering anxiety, or is it an oppositional and defiant nature that's the result of something that's fractured? Please do like this video. Please do subscribe to my channel. It makes a huge difference. 80-90% I think of my traffic comes from external sources and the people who haven't subscribed. So please do pop on, hit like, hit subscribe, and ring the bell so that you know when there's new content coming out. We've got some great stuff coming up. Got an interview with Dan White coming up in the next week or so, who is a journalist and an absolute legend, a really great guy who is a carer, has a disabled daughter, and is just a remarkable human being. I will see you again next week, and stay safe.